question is directed to. And if you're posting on social media, then please do use the hashtag WolvesLitFest. At the end of the event, we'll ask you to complete a short questionnaire, which will be really helpful for us, just so that we can understand our audience better, and so that we can plan our future events. So that's it from me, and without further ado, I'm now going to hand over to Sebastian Groes to get things started.
Great. I think you should be able to see my screen now. So thank you very much. My name is Sebastian Groes. I work at the University of Wolverhampton as a professor in literature. I want to welcome everyone to the audience. Nice to see your faces. And we're delighted to have with us Will Self, who's back since 2018 when we did, in a galaxy far, far away in the pre-pandemic age, we did a sold-out event in the Georgian Room in the Wolverhampton Art Gallery. So we're delighted to welcome Will back at this event, where we'll be discussing what happens when we remember fiction that we read in the past, and what happens when we reread novels, when we return to fiction. So a couple of things, this event is being recorded and will be made available later online as well. Our event is also organized in partnership with the Wolverhampton Literature Festival, Wolverhampton's School of Humanities, and the Research Centre for Transnational and Transcultural Studies, as well as BBC Arts. And this event is funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, the AHRC, which is funding a project that I'm leading currently called Novel Perceptions Towards an Inclusive Canon. That's this project, so do have a look at this if you can. The aim for this project is to find out what people think is high literary quality, good fiction. And we're trying to see how people attribute literary quality to fiction they read recently. So we're doing something different today. I'll tell you about that in a second. But we're at this event looking via the Novel Perceptions project at a different strand, which is to do with novel memories and remembering fiction. And there are two kind of surveys that we would like you to take when we leave this event. So the first one is novel memories, and Georgina will put the links in the chat box to think about how we remember fiction, how we attribute emotions, what scenes do we remember? Do we remember any speeches? So this is what we'd like to know in this first survey. And the second survey is really about what happens when we return to fiction. Does our perspective change of the plot, of the characters? Are there new emotions taking place? So that's the second survey that we would like you to partake in. So if you can do this after this event, that would be very much appreciated. To start off with, we thought it would be a nice kind of way of thinking about those surveys, about how we remember fiction, by doing an interactive experiment with you. And later on, we'll talk to Will about how he remembers fiction and how his rereading of Dostoevsky's The Idiot, how he experienced that. But before we do that, there is a psychological experiment that we want to invite you to partake in with my colleague Tom Mercer, who is a psychologist at the University of Wolverhampton. So, Tom.
Thanks, Baz. Yes, so hi everyone. I'll be taking you through this activity. As Baz mentioned, what we're doing here is kind of a short interactive test to look at what you can remember about certain novels, but also what you can remember about how you felt about certain novels. So we'll go to the first option. So we got three options. Two of them we've pre-selected. The final one is kind of free choice. So you might not be able to do it for everything, but hopefully you'll definitely be able to do it for the last novel. And the first novel is George Orwell's 1984. So we'll launch a poll for you now, and you'll hopefully be able to see 5 questions, which are basically asking you about what you remember about this novel and what you remember about your feelings of that novel. So if we can get that poll up. There we go. So, okay, great. So you'll see there's a number of questions. I'll go through these with you, and if you can fill them in as we go along, that'd be really good if you've read 1984. So the first question is whether you remember many passages or scenes from 1984. Can you remember many of those passages? And you'll hopefully be able to see you've got a few options. You might not remember any passages. You might remember one or two. You might remember a few or quite a few. Or you might actually remember many passages from 1984. So if you can select the option that best kind of fits that. The second question then kind of builds on that slightly. So in the second question, we're asking you about if you remember specific lines of prose or specific dialogue. So do you remember what certain characters might have said in 1984? And again, there's a similar set of options. So you might remember none of it. You might remember one or two lines of prose or dialogue. You might remember a few or quite a few, or even many, but we just want to get your sense of that. And then the third question is whether you remember how 1984 ended. Do you remember clearly how that novel ended? That's just a yes or no option. And then in question 4, we start to move on to think about how you felt when you read that novel. This is quite a general question, asking about the strength of any emotions you might have felt. So did you feel strong emotions, moderate emotions, mild emotions? Maybe you didn't feel any emotions, or maybe you don't remember. That's question 4. I mean, question 5 picks that up in a bit more detail. It's asking for specific emotions you might have felt. So did you feel happiness, sadness, anger, fear, disgust? Maybe it was other emotions, maybe it was no emotions, or maybe you don't remember. But I can see people are filling it in, so that's great. We'll give you a little bit longer, a few more seconds to fill that in.
It's me.
Please, audience, can you please keep yourself on mute throughout this event, please? Thank you.
Okay, give it another kind of 10 seconds or so we don't take too long with this. It's very interesting. We'll shortly publish the results to you so you can hopefully see everything. Okay, so I think that's a good point. If we can share the results at this stage, I can try and go through these with you. And so let's have a look. So if we think about the first question here, whether you remember many passages, well, the majority of people don't remember any passages at all, or maybe remember one or two passages, but it's harder to remember more than that. Now in question 2, specific lines of prose or dialogue, we're seeing a very similar kind of effect here. Most people aren't remembering any dialogue, or maybe if you do one or two, but it is hard to remember more than that. About just under half of people remember how the story ended, 1984, so quite a few don't remember how it ended. But when we look at the emotions, okay, this is interesting. So we see people feeling strong and moderate emotions generally, about 80% of people, and specific emotions, sadness, anger, fear, disgust as well, a little bit, some other emotions, but you are being able to remember the emotions, which is really interesting. So if we move on to our second novel, that is Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. So if you have read To Kill a Mockingbird, we're going to do a very similar poll for you. So we'll launch that poll now. It's the same set of questions that you'll have seen with this first poll. So again, it's just kind of working your way through those when that becomes available. And just, yeah, doing the same thing. It'll give you kind of a minute or so to kind of fill that in, but similar things. So now this is about To Kill a Mockingbird. There we go. So that's live now. So yeah, if you're happy to work your way through, same set of questions, again, looking at, do you remember passages from the novel? Do you remember specific lines of prose? Do you remember the ending? And do you remember much about how you felt when you read that novel? So yeah, same thing as before. If you can do that, it'd be really, really good. And if you haven't read this novel, we will give you a free choice in the final poll, which is coming up next. Yeah, this is great. I can see lots of answers coming in, so thank you for doing this. Our survey is kind of on a mini scale of what we're doing in the big survey. So I'll give you a little bit longer to fill that in, and we'll post the results shortly. Okay, if we can publish these results here, sorry it's quite rapid, but what we are seeing here in the results is a very similar pattern. So again, not that many people are remembering a lot of specific passages or scenes from the novel. The majority don't remember any. Similar thing with the dialogue. It's very, very hard to remember specific things people said. About a quarter of people remember one or two, but it is difficult to remember more than that. 57% remember how this one ends, though, so a little bit better than 1984, but a lot don't. But again, when we're looking at the emotions, strong and moderate emotions are very common, with a range of emotions being felt, but sadness and anger being quite common, which fits with the kind of the nature of this novel. So that's great, thank you. So we're going to move on to the final novel. This is a bit different because here we're giving you a chance to choose your favourite novel. This is the last one of these we're doing. So we'll launch the poll, very, very similar thing again, but this time pick your favourite novel. If you don't have one clear favourite, you can pick one of your favourites. If 1984 or To Kill a Mockingbird is your favourite novel, then again, you know, pick another one that you really, really like. But exactly the same thing with the poll, 5 questions again. If you can go through those, indicate your answers. It'll be interesting to see if things are different when you're picking one of your very favourite novels. So yeah, we'll give you a little bit of time if you can be filling that in. You can see the answers are coming in. That's really good. Thank you. I'll give you a little bit of time just to fill in your answers. Favourite novels this time. I can see a lot of answers coming in. This is looking interesting. We'll share these with you shortly. If you want to, you can also put your favourite novel in the chat area. If you filled in the poll and you just want to let us know what your favourite novel is, feel free to enter that into the chat. We'll keep that open for a little bit so we can get a sense of what your favourite novels are. Obviously, the other 2 polls have been very specific. This one is going to be much more open. Okay, so last few seconds, fill in those final answers and then we'll share the results with you. Thanks for everyone putting these in the chat as well. Interesting to see the range of your favourite novels. Okay, so we'll publish the results for this final poll here. And this is looking a little bit different when we show you these results. As it makes sense, with it being your favourite novel, it does seem that people can remember a bit more about that novel. So you can remember more of the passages, more of the scenes from that novel. And you can remember a bit more of kind of what he said, although still a lot of people can't remember a lot of that, but there is more so maybe than 1984 or To Kill a Mockingbird. You're all very clear on how the story ended, or most of you are very clear on how the story ended. Your favourite novel, 88%. And maybe this is to do with your familiarity with the novel, how many times you've reread it or experienced adaptations to that novel. In terms of emotions, we can see these are very strong or moderate emotions being felt, with a whole range of emotions, but happiness being the most common, which is very, very interesting. So thank you for everyone for doing that. What I'll just do now for the kind of last minute or so is just give you a summary of what we found in our bigger survey. So we've been doing this on a bigger scale with more questions. We've had over 340 people do it. And what we're finding is very similar to what we've seen in this interactive poll here, that most people do struggle to remember specific details about novels, specific passages, specific scenes, specific things that were said. And a lot of people don't clearly remember the ending either. But when you ask people about the emotions they feel, they seem to be much clearer on that. They can tell us the emotions they felt and the strength of those emotions. So it nicely overlaps with what we've seen here. Now, another thing we've found relates to something called the Reminiscence Bump. So we asked our participants how old they were when they read the novel they'd chosen. Most of our participants were sort of in the 40s or older, But the novel they chose, they said they first read that when they were a teenager or a young adult, and it overlaps with a period called this Reminiscence Bump. On the next screen, we've got an image to show you that, but it's basically when people around 50 are recalling memories from their life, there's a lot more of those memories between the ages of 10 and 30, and that's a reminiscence bump, this peak of memories. And it also seems to be a time when we do encounter our favourite novels. Now, one final thing we've found is that we've also asked people at that time in their life, when they read the novel, how did they feel? And 45% of our participants have said they were in a happy mood when they read that novel, generally in their life, even though the novel might have been quite dark. So there seems to be this kind of bias for the positive emotions, which also overlaps with the reminiscence bump, where we do see more kind of positive and happy memories from that time of our lives. But thank you very much for doing that. I hope that was interesting, and you are welcome to take part in our main survey as well. That's it from me, Baz. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. That was really great and very insightful, I feel. So the gist of this is really that we maybe lose a sense of the plots, specific character traits and those types of things. And we remember the emotions that we associated with the novel itself, but also it seems that the context in which we find ourselves shapes our memories, right? So if we were in a happier mood, we attribute happier feelings to a novel. So it's really quite an interesting kind of intertwining of fiction and life. So I think this is why we are bringing in Will Self today, to maybe talk us through the intricacies of that kind of process. And will be reading from his memoir, Will, a bit later on. And we've got some interesting questions for that as well. But Will, can you say something about the poll you just did and about your memories of 1984 or To Kill a Mockingbird, or which novel did you choose for the final round?
Well, I think, you know, the problem is, Baz, that, you know, it's confirmation bias, you know, surveys of literature, the design even of the study. I mean, I do hope Tom is virtually illiterate, or else his involvement in the whole project is irredeemably skewed by confirmation bias. Because, you know, literature is studied by people who like reading books, bizarrely enough. And often people who read books reread books, rather shockingly. But that's a bit like life. I mean, neuroscience suggests that, you know, memories are really only memories of memories. So why shouldn't memories of books be memories of the last time you read the book rather than the first time? Absolutely. All of which is by way of saying, of course, I've read, unfortunately, both those titles several times. So, you know, and I've taught them. So, you know, I'm not really a very good subject for those particular volumes for the test at all.
It's interesting. I was thinking of as a teacher of literature, I was thinking of Frankenstein and how I remember that text. And because I've taught it on Gothic modules and on an introductory literature module, you kind of remember it in a much different way than things I read when I was 13 or 14. So one of the key books that really shaped my own kind of life and started my love for literature was The Hobbit, which I read when I was about 13, something like that. And I can't really remember much about it. I remember the ring and the landscapes, those types of things. But the specific turns in the plot, I've kind of really lost those. And it's also, from what I remember, it ends on a kind of a cliffhanger. There is no clear kind of ending to the Hobbit because it's part of a sequel. So I was wondering, do you associate particular novels from your childhood or your teenage years with a particular feeling, emotion? What sticks out when you think back to your teens? Which fiction shaped you?
Well, again, I think it's a bit different if you know, are quite self-consciously a professional writer. You start viewing, you know, and history's written by the winners. What a surprise. So, you know, if you do turn out to be a professional writer, you start to regard your young life as a Künstlerroman, as a kind of, you know, story of an artist's becoming, which I'm sure you don't if you don't, you know, or you do in a different way, because of course, you know, if anything, recent modish changes in literature teach us, it's that everybody does have a novel in them.
Yeah.
You know, so what I found, and I think what your research amply confirms, and I think you and Tom have designed it perfectly well, and I was just teasing you a bit, because it certainly conforms to what I'm sure everybody present in this weird virtual space will readily assent to. It's the feelings that matter, not some kind of rational intellection about your past or your past reading. It is the feeling from the past that leads you to the remembered text, with the exception, I'd say, and again, there are certain texts that you analyze as a teacher, as a writer, as a reader, that you know mechanically in a different way. And, you know, so when it got on to the third question of the survey, I was trying to remember Dostoevsky's The Idiot, which I read when I was around 15. And I could not remember a damn thing about the book, frankly. I even misattributed in the little survey. I did your survey before the event.
Yeah.
I completely got everything wrong about it, sort of practically, apart from the absolute bare bones of it. And when I started rereading it yesterday for the first time in 44 years, it was like one of those adverts you get, or sort of effects you get on a computer when the world is colored in just in advance of you, or, you know, like something out of Christopher Nolan's Inception, where it sort of shimmers into being. As I was reading it, as I read each line, I thought, I know what the next line is. I know where this is going. I know where that's going. And I'm sure anybody who read, and again, the analogy, of course, and it's what we always know about the relationship between literature and life is literature and literature is life. Just as when you put somebody in an MRI machine and they're reading a complex passage of prose, their brain lights up like a Christmas tree with exactly the same centers as if they were doing the activities that they're interpreting and decoding from the text. So our way, I mean, you know, when you were talking with Tom about this survey and Tom was going through it, I was thinking, yeah, you know, that's the problem with my relationship with my life. I lost the plot, literally, as well as metaphorically, because you look back at your past, and unless you're, you know, the police employ these people called super recognizers, and they can, I'm sure Tom knows about this, they can look at thousands of human faces, something like 5,000 human faces, 3 seconds a face, and then you show them 50 faces, and they can tell you whether they've seen it already or not. Their capacity for recall is extraordinary. And you meet people in life who are like that. You know, the people with the birthday book, the people who send out the cards, the people who are kind of locked into ordinal time in that way. For some reason, their memory works. And then there's people who are unbelievably episodic in their view of their lives and just delete, rewrite, sometimes to the level of sociopathy, and sometimes within an acceptable mean, you know. So I think I tend towards the episodic rather than the narrative myself. You know, or what some people call the sort of diachronic view of one's life. I tend towards the view. I mean, I certainly don't think, you know, to bring it onto this memoir, I certainly don't think I'm the young man in the memoir at all. Not really, not in all sorts of important senses. No.
One thing that Tom hasn't spoken about, but something that struck me basically last week, it's really about the novel form itself, about fictional forms. And I was talking to a colleague, and he was making the comment that he read this biography by someone like a year ago, and he's completely forgotten all the details of this biography, of this person's life, right? But at the time, it's kind of so factual and you're immersed in it. So what is it about fiction? What is it about the architecture of fiction that makes it stick in the mind? What do you think as a novelist? Because go on.
Yeah, I mean, it's again, while you guys were discussing it and the audience were doing the survey, I was thinking, and the description, the memory bump, the period during which you commit things, and I just remembered being staying at this sort of chain hotel in Manchester a few years ago and going out onto the balcony to have a smoke. And the guy came out onto the balcony alongside me, about 10 years younger than me. And he looked across at me and he said, blimey, it's you, it's real self, isn't it? I said, yeah. And he said, you know what? I read a novel of yours when I was a young man that really made a big impression on me. And I immediately felt, of course, as you would, immensely gratified. Isn't that what we're all in the game for, in a strange sort of a way?
Sure.
And he then said, yeah, it made a big impression on me. What was it called? What was it? But and he couldn't. Not only could he not remember the name of the book that had made an enormous impression on him, he in fact could remember nothing about it at all. So, which is a sort of, and I sort of thought to myself, and I'd often thought before, it really doesn't matter which book it is read during that phase. Many books could unlock that portion of that young man that was sensibility or psyche. He thought it happened to be one of mine, which he then couldn't remember anyway, because of course, what you need to remember stuff is a mnemonic superstructure, not just an internal structure to the thing you're remembering. And I think James Gleick writes about this very well in The Information when he analyzes the way that poetry works in oral cultures. And he's making the point that everything, the setting, the repetition, the meter, the rhyme are devised to create mnemonics that not only work internally to the structure of what's being remembered, but also because they're geared into the social structure that is externalized in the ritual performance of the epic poem, oral poem, are there as constant cues for the reciter. So, we don't live in a culture that has that kind of nanotechnology necessarily built into its texts. And arguably the abandonment by some writers such as myself of the kind of paratextual elements of the novel are depriving readers of what little, mnemonics are left in the externality of the text. And then all you're left with is what we began with, which is emotions. I remember the rats eating his face. I remember the horror I felt as a young child when I realized that somebody really could be condemned to death for a crime they didn't commit on the basis of an arbitrary characteristic like their ethnicity. I really remember that, but I remember absolutely bugger all of the rest of it, just as
So the point, I guess, is as well, it's really about your own life and the context. And I guess with the technological kind of digital age that surrounds us, we're shifting to, Daniel Kahneman would call it system 2, right? It's more the kind of instinctual, emotive kind of thinking that is triggered by the internet and the way we click in a lateral way when we are online, which we are now 24 hours a day, which then has an effect on how we remember or not remember, basically, both our own lives and novels. So it's really interesting. Well, we can talk more about this maybe later, but I think it would be good if we
if I could just make the point, Baz, that the amnesia that people fear and is present, for example, in the obsession with the idea that traumatogenic memory, and this is something that's particularly modish in literary theory at the moment, as you'll be aware, that traumatogenic memory has a particular epistemic status that is both under threat, is in some sense contested by the human mind, by social formations, by deep level semiotic structuring itself, and yet is something that has an absolute moral validity. And I actually think, good modernist that I am, that is a reflection of our use of specular technologies, if you'll forgive the tautologist statement. It's because we're online the whole time, taking selfies of ourselves, we're living in an ephemeral and evanescent, non-nanotechnic culture, in fact. The paradox is the web stores everything, so you remember nothing. You know, and remember, it was Socrates who warned against writing itself as a mnemotechnology that would damage people's memories.
Yeah, Plato.
So where are we now, guys?
Plato was really against writing because any kind of way of writing allows you to forget. So yeah, this is the great threat that our good friend
this
Jacques
is an
Derrida
entirely virtual event that's being recorded. Why is the recording of it any less valid than the event itself?
I prefer the recording, and I'm gonna watch it.
I think
later.
this may be the recording.
It could be a recording. It feels like it's kind of something unreal about this. Okay, I want to move to maybe a short reading from your memoir and maybe talk a bit about the intertwining of life and fiction, etc. And maybe the audience, if you have any questions, can you put those in the chat box? And after the reading, I'll read out a couple of questions for Will to kind of answer. So, Will, can you maybe read from Will?
Will, May 1986. Standing in the Clapham Road on a Sunday, Tuesday morning, Will thinks you're standing in the Clapham Road on a May morning in the mid-1980s. Is this it? The space above him is no only sky, but an ice cream head-aching void, its pale blue depths tinged lemony by the early summer sun. Is this who you are? He queries aloud, then runs on in a moaning undertone. A frightened young man of 24, fraying, no, fuck it, falling apart. Will fumbles in his sad little grab bag of received wisdom and comes up with, when addicts are getting plenty of junk, they look anonymous, but when they start to withdraw, their image sharpens, then disintegrates. Still standing in the Clapham Road on a bright weekday morning with the traffic grumbling along beside him, Will feels his sweat-stiffened socks begin to melt. Soon, he thinks, I'll be immobilized. A sick junkie, petrified by withdrawal and sunk deep in silent solipsistic agony, a suffering of the cells alone. Yes, he'll be immobilized right here on the wide pavement beside the shitty little shopping parade. There's a bookies, a chip shop, and a plastic shop, like the one in Burnt Oak Will worked in on Saturdays when he was a teenager. His first real job, if by that is meant a manila wages packet, with inside it a well-worn tenner, a fiver, some coin, riches. Crawling around on the dirty checkerboard of linoleum with a sticker gun, pricing up a Trixo hand cream, while lumpy and careworn legs, thickly hosed, shuffled about him. Is that the hand cream, love? Giss a tube, will ya? Yes, giss a tube magically metamorphosed into a giant morphine syringe, the sort Brother Bill served his apprenticeship, shooting up. There's also a chemist's on the corner of this shabby parade, a small one. No doubt the pharmacist got his qualifications in Kampala and never imagined he'd end up here among stores selling artificial limbs, wig makers, a point where dubious enterprise touches Skid Row. Soon enough, Will thinks, the locals will come stumbling, drooling, squealing for their methadone, little green bottles labeled poison that are, in point of fact, their poison. True, there's nothing remotely euphoric about methadone. It just makes you feel as if you're buried up to your waist. Buried up to your waist, and possibly, by that fact alone, enjoying a happy day. But Will doesn't have a methadone script, doesn't have 20 mils of green gloop to pour on the wateriness of his own dissolution. Why? because if he did, he'd be a fucking no-hoper, loser junkie, really. The sort of idiot who goes out kiting, scores, cooks up, finds a vein, flushes the works, then squirts wide arcs of claret across the dingy wallpaper.
Great, thank you so much. Wonderful stuff. That's from the opening, Will. I was just wondering, how did you go about writing the memo, and why now? Was there a decision?
Money.
Okay, okay. Of course.
Who but a fool would write for anything else? I've been working on these really kind of highly experimental, or not highly experimental, these kind of different novels. And I think, you know, perhaps lacking the paratextual information that people like. And, you know, I was conscious that if I wanted to continue doing the work I wanted, I've always understood this, I'd have to offer something up to the market that might be a little bit more assimilable. So that was my impetus in part, I confess. I'm honest about it.
Yeah, sure.
Who asked for anything else? I didn't really want to write memoir. And I've got to say, I think it was a mistake in a way to package the book as a memoir. It's really a work of auto-fiction.
Yeah, it reads like fiction.
You know, who the hell remembers conversations from last year, or indeed last week, let alone from 40 years ago? So, but that being said, may I say in my own defense, having decided to write it, I was utterly committed to doing it with as much honesty and effectiveness as I could. And that's really where your own research comes into this, Baz, because having realized that the authenticity we carry with us is an emotional authenticity, what we do remember is the feeling when we saw, you know, when we broke up with our first love, when we saw our first child, or when we learned that we never would have a child, or when we lost a parent, or we lost somebody. The feeling, the intensity of feeling, the epiphanies we may have had in life that have radically recentered our being, these we do remember. That chord of emotion does stretch through time, and I believe unites multifarious identities. And once I'd committed to writing the memoir, really the methodology was to, in a sense, shin back down these chords of emotion into the past. And, you know, I may be an old hack, but I can't read the passage with the young man of 26 who's, you know, realizes he's a heroin addict, realizes he's going to, as it were, be immobilized quite soon due to his withdrawal from heroin. And I feel that intrinsic sympathy towards him. In a way, I feel, I don't feel towards the abstraction will self, the codification at all. It's a different thing.
Interesting. I'm going to turn to the audience now, because I've got some questions for you. We may discuss more about the intricacies of returning to those emotions, but I'm also wondering if you went into the archives, whether you went to old diaries to get back some facts as well, because
well, yeah, I had the luxury, not only, of course, being I mean, again, history is not only written by the winners, it's written by the winners because they kept all the manky old postcards wrapped up in rubber bands. And they can go, actually, I know what you wrote to me because I've still got it. So, so yeah, I kept a lot of the paperwork. I mean, I also discarded a lot. I had quite a peripatetic life, and was fortunate enough to have my archive taken over by the British Library a few years ago and properly archived. So I not only had all the letters, I could even access them quite easily, not just have to crawl up into the attic and sort of put your leg through between the trusses. And the answer is I didn't consult much of it at all, because it wasn't true to that reality of my life. What I would have been doing is constructing, in my view, a false diachronic identity, a kind of meta identity. If I'd read letters from the past and then I'd had an I writing the memoir saying, I did this and I did that, you know, my watchword was a moral imperative for writing any kind of biographical writing. And, you know, Nietzsche says in the Genealogy of Morals, Memory says you did that. Pride says I can't have done that. The two of them contend, and pride always wins. And you know what? It always does win. It even wins, I contend, when it doesn't seem to be winning, particularly in the kind of, oh, I used to be dreadful and look at me now. I'm so much better. Don't you admire me all the more because I've been through it type memoir, you know, which is, you know, Wittgenstein said, you know, if somebody tells me he's been to the worst of places, I have no right to judge him. But if he says it was his superior intellect that enabled him to go there, I know he's a fraud. And he's quite right, you know, and it is. The benefit of hindsight is the fraudulent superior intellect. So I knew it had to be written in the continuous present to reflect the emotional reality of the time.
Sure.
Just as I knew that any constructed I, in my view, in relation to autobiographical material, is fraudulent and a creature of pride. So it just can't exist. So to write it in the light of an archive that is, you know, as it were, assembled ex post facto would be equally fraudulent. Now, it just so happens that the girlfriend I was with throughout this period is a super rememberer and kept diaries, and I was still on good enough terms and hopefully conscientious enough terms for her to be the book's first reader. So, and she didn't dissent from any of the actuality at all. So that was good enough for me. I didn't really write it with reference to any paper at all. I wrote it from memory of feeling.
Interesting. It's really fascinating, the importance of memory in structuring the past as well. I've got some questions from the audience, Will. So Jason says the following: I've read quite a few of your fictional novels, and fictionals put in quotation marks, and I don't really think of them emotionally. I also read Will, which I think of as a non-fiction novel, and I found my experience was more emotional. Is this something you were conscious of whilst you were writing it? So this person has more of an emotional connection to the memoir or whatever.
It's just a disaster. I mean, clearly it's a disaster. I haven't affected him emotionally at all. He just regards it like some ghastly glass bead game. He just sort of dry and shuffling around of things. I don't know. I mean, I just feel I've failed. Obviously I've tried to articulate things emotionally in my fiction, and that seems to me, I mean, I've always been, as it were, pretty unashamedly a novelist of ideas as well, but perhaps that's my undoing. And yeah, maybe he's absolutely right. The virtue of the memoir stroke autofiction is that it does absolutely rely just on feeling and nothing else. Whereas I confess I've never really been able to sit down and write a novel without thinking, you know, there's some idea in the back of it, something I want, some sense of reality I want to get across.
But I guess what Jason is saying is that potentially knowing that this is real life, or a version of real life, has triggered more emotions than a fiction will do. There is a kind of a difference there. So maybe that's
I just think that's so odd. I think we're all so odd about the distinction between fiction and reality and what we think it is. It's like what we're saying is, surely we need to turn it around. What we're really saying is there are certain things that arouse me morally, in a sense, or arouse my capacity for sympathy, and there are other things that simply don't. And it's a kind of denial of the reality, in a sense, of things like ideology, solidarity, you know, as it were, conceptual systems that lie outside of immediate human intentionality, but nonetheless animate people, you know.
Yeah, right. I've got a question from Ben here. So he's asking, why do you think my literature students take so strongly to the argument you once made in The Guardian, which was that the one thing that characterizes this generation is the resistance to difficulty? Do you want to
So his students don't like that argument? They do like it?
They take strongly to the argument. So I guess they want to reject that because it comes
I would
down
say, I mean,
against students.
the exact form of words would suggest that they adopt it for their own. They take to it. But let's, maybe he'll type something on the chat to clarify.
Yeah.
I'd be surprised. I mean, I think that there is a false equivalence at the moment between difficulty and forms of, as it were, social and economic elitism, and it's part of the problem with the idea of upstream cultural change generally. I would charge the upstreamers with not paying attention to how brilliant capitalism is at rendering everything fungible. We're all going to hell on a pride float sponsored by Barclays. The consistent commodification within the arena of what people think of as liberal discourse of anything that is a dissenting position means that people resort to the idea that difficulty is in some way snobbish or elitist because they identify and attack upon things that might be perceived as more not coming clothed in the armature of a discourse that is already established for whatever reason or other as being necessarily revolutionary, subversive, altering the status quo, whereas of course I'd argue they're already co-opted by the status quo before they've made the argument. It's a false, it's what I think of as a negative rather than a positive intersection, in that way, so I think the kind of argument about difficulty also is really just an argument. It's a McLuhanite argument about mediums and messages, and it goes back to what we've been discussing about memory. The technology is inimical to the kind of memory, just the building of data in people's heads. And God knows, we're not the first generation to note this. Our parents and grandparents' generation knew, within the English culture, for example, would have known reams of poetry by heart, reams of it. I'm sorry, I think there is a difference, and Nicholas Carr limns this territory very well in his book, The Shallows. There is an argument that you need a lot of onboard data before you can instantaneously apply schemas to new data. You just need it. It's no good going to Mr. Google or asking a friend when you have to make a snap decision on a new basis of data. And I think the resistance to difficulty is all part of that. And when you teach at a university, and you'll have had this experience, Baz, and anybody who teaches at a higher education level will have in the last few years, and a student writes to you very politely and says, I'm finding it difficult to do your course because you're asking me to read, and they're studying literature, then you really know you've come to a strange place.
Who knows? I mean, the Victorian novel is still going very strong at Wolverhampton. Our students really, really like the long novels as well still. So who knows?
Well, you're doing well then, is all I can say. You must be, as a department, managing to inculcate reading in a different way. I mean, I've absolutely considered sort of negative breakout sessions for students at which they would go off grid together to read, because I think the insistent presence even of a smartphone just being on is enough to drag the psyche away from the text.
It's true. I've got a question for Will and for Tom, so I'm not sure if Tom is still here. Matthew says, I found both my favorite novel and my non-fiction books very funny throughout, and I remember many humorous moments. This presumably isn't coincidental, so maybe, I'm not sure if Tom is still here, but Will, you can answer maybe as well. So is there something about genre or maybe comedy that makes us remember it better? It nestles inside our brain in a different way. So there is maybe a genre issue here as well. What do you think, Tom?
From a general memory point of view, and we do tend to remember emotional things better than non-emotional events, and we've seen more that people might have a bias towards positive information, which maybe that's why the funny or the humorous scenes stand out. So that's probably what I'd say from the memory point of view.
Yeah, I guess it's a very strong emotion. So highly happy stuff, and maybe grotesque, disgusting scenes will stand out. Horror, right? Will, what do you think?
Well, I mean, you know, the bits of that passage I read from the memoir that were in a slightly gravelly Midwestern American accent were glosses on William Burroughs's Junkie, which I read before I became a heroin addict, and have probably reread, you know, as many times, actually. I think it's a brilliant novel. And of course, it spoke strongly to my own experience. It still remains unrivaled as an account of what it's like to have an addictive illness in that way, I think. And of course, it's full of grotesque scenes and humor. So yeah, it would stick with me. Another one for me, but again, the problem is I've reread these books many times. That's what writers, I think, tend to do, because we want, you know, it's just like taking a car engine apart. You know, the way you learn, and sorry, I am dissing the current generation as well, because it's not just reading, it's good, you got to reread, and not just twice, like 5 or 6 times, because it's like taking a car engine apart. How do you know how it works unless you strip it right back down? And the other one for me is Heller's Catch-22. It was love at first sight. First time Yossarian saw the chaplain, he fell in love with him. Yossarian was in the hospital with an illness that was a bit like jaundice, but wouldn't quite become it, or some words to that effect. You know, again, a novel that's beautifully paced, built up out of extraordinary set piece scenes, and kind of elevate long, as it were, gags, almost sight gags in a way. So yeah, absolutely. They stay with you.
Interesting. So we haven't got too much time left, and we've got so many questions for you, Will. So I'm going to choose 2, and I'm not sure, maybe we'll save those and see if we can return to those questions another time. So I've got a question about, a technical question really, about Will, the memoir. So it's set in the third person, because you keep on mentioning Will does this, Will does that, right? And this person's asking, it is James. Why not using I or he? So he's saying, is the book set in the third person style in the same as a way of leading the narrative without using I and instead saying he? So
well, I mean, I sort of already answered this.
So,
you know, as I say, I think the I is spurious. If I read a memoir by somebody and says, I was at school, I think, no, you weren't. You're a fat celebrity who's cashed in by doing a book deal that's nothing to do with you. You weren't at this school in the 1950s. That's someone else.
Absolutely.
You know? So I just think that's spurious, and I think you're stepping aside from it, and you're trying. Pride is attempting to win. You say I say pride. I think I do use he, obviously. You know, I don't relentlessly say of the character, but I have to say it works. I mean, I do think of the character as the character. I don't think of him as me, and it has changed. You know, it makes a good way to discriminate between what you own as a person and what you don't. What you don't own.
Yeah. Final question is about Umbrella. Actually, it's Chris who says, I recall reading Umbrella, your novel, and I can clearly remember constantly saying, whoa, this is incredibly high quality use of language. By that I mean I encountered so many words I had not met before. My question is, where did Will's incredible knowledge of English words come from? So your verbosity, I guess. Was it merely reading voraciously and interrogating the dictionary as you read, or what? So I guess this also is a question about poetry, I guess, about vocabulary, the breadth, the verbosity. So how do you go about that? Do you artificially go to a dictionary, or is this really in your brain? That's the question.
Well, I mean, I admit it's a foible. I've felt it good. That's new language. That's good language. It's a foible. I think it's a foible seems a bit of an understatement. I mean, one of the first novel I wrote was about an obsessive sesquipedalian, and whether or not I was answering that tendency in myself, or whether it kind of acted as a reciprocal thing to kind of crank it up, I don't know. But that's when it got out of hand. It's true. And I do feel a bit, I accept the charge. I mean, it is a bit weird to have, you know, what the Americans call, you know, $5 words around the place. And it has become a bit of a compulsion. But on the other hand, you know, I'm sorry, my view is we live in an immiserated era in which people judge literature far too much by what they imagine to be its content. You know, whether that content is, you know, it's an issue book or it's about the writer's identity. It's the same thing to me. And I'm afraid I'm with Susan Sontag. To me, style, you know, content is not even subsidiary to style. It doesn't exist without style.
Yeah, sure.
You know, so I just think of writing as first and foremost being an art with words, with the words of the medium. If you don't think about it in that way, I mean, you're just not a writer, as I understand it. You're not trying to write literature. You're trying to write something else, you know.
So it's really interesting. But for us as researchers, for Tom and myself, we are absolutely looking also at how the degree of difficulty grammatical structures nestle themselves in the brain. So we have to...
Well, sorry, it's funny. I'm just sorry to break in, but that's the other point, of course, which is that, you know, I don't think people think about it this way. The point of the writer's job is to draw the reader's attention to the rules they didn't know that they were following. Just like Saussure teaches us in his, you know, relay general course in linguistics, that we speak according to grammatical rules that we have internalized and never actually formally learned. You know, it's the same revelation. And if you're not doing that as a writer, I'd argue you're not really doing anything in a way. You're just it's passing on information, you know.
Okay, we have to end it there, Will. Thank you so much for joining us today. Can I ask the audience to, if they have time this afternoon, can they do the novel memories surveys that are in the chat box? It would really be helpful. So we're going to leave you with Margarita, who's going to say goodbye on behalf of the festival. Thank you very much, Will, for being our guest today. Thank you so much. Really wonderful.
Thank you, Baz, and everybody. Thank you.
Margarita? Okay, I believe...
Oh, okay, sorry, I'm just having trouble unmuting myself then. I've been muted by our host. Yeah, I just want to say thank you very much to the panel, to Baz Groes and Tom Mercer and Will Self for that really interesting discussion. Thanks to our audience for all your wonderful questions. Thanks to the LitFest team, Georgina and Phil, that have been working in the background to make sure everything ran so smoothly. And I'm just going to invite you all to unmute now and just give our panel a round of applause. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.
Thank you.